I'm Edie Lush, and I'm here at the Innovate Finance Conference for Hub Culture. Really pleased to be joined by Jean-Louis Schiltz. Thanks so much for coming along.
Thank you.
Now, you are a professor at the Luxembourg University, former cabinet minister, and you are a tech law advisor. Now, tell me, you've been working on digital identity. Tell me about that work, first of all.
Well, actually, I started working on digital identity 4 or 5 years ago. And when I was advising fintech companies, actually what we find out is that identifying their customer and even more so verifying the identity of their customer was really painful exercise. And so we were looking for new avenues, and I got in touch with Stan, with people at the MIT, etc. And ever since we worked on digital identity projects in Luxembourg, but also in the United States.
Now I can see how it's important for banks. I can see how it's important for people who don't have an identity, who don't have a passport, to have some kind of digital identity. So tell me about that. Tell me about the opportunity that this presents.
Well, you know, the discussion on we have 1.5 billion people in the world who actually don't have an identity like you and I have with a passport and an ID card if you're in Europe. And it reminds me actually of the discussion we had 10 years ago about the mobile phones. I was pretty much involved in Africa at the time, and when poor people were being provided with phones, mobile phones at the time, people were asking the question, why on earth are you giving these people mobile phones where they need shelter, where they need security, where they need healthcare, etc. And yet I think the experience over the last decade has shown that these mobile phones were a real accelerator of development, and the same thing applies to digital identity. And by the way, today it is my view that when we're talking about digital identity, the first opener for digital identity were these mobile phones like 10 years ago.
So tell me, what's your latest work around? What's the most exciting thing for you at the moment?
Well, for the moment the question is, how do we have many identity providers out there now. How do you standardize the solutions they are offering? How do you make them interoperable? How do you make sure that it's the individual who owns the identity and not the government or some sort of private company?
Yeah.
I didn't want to mention any
That's okay, I will.
names. And all these challenges are technical challenges, but also regulatory challenges. And my part is really on the regulatory part. On top of that, you can ask your questions whether these identity providers should be regulated in some sort of way, and how does the public sector and the private sector interact in that regulation. That's a whole new area where we're exploring new ground actually.
And where do you think who should own the identity? I mean, presumably I should own my identity, right? But how many people actually have access to it? So many.
Well, I think the question on who owns the identity is a little bit a strange question if we look at it from a traditional point of view. Because yes, you own your identity, but do you own your digital identity? That's the point. Or how do you get control over your digital identity, again, if you've lost it in the meantime? And that is, I think, one of the largest regulatory challenges. Yet at the same time, someone needs to do the work that is necessary so that you can have a digital identity, and someone needs to confirm that your digital identity is your digital identity, basically that you are you and not someone else. And there comes the interaction today between the private sector and the public sector. I don't see the private sector doing it on its own, and I don't see the public sector doing it on its own.
So from a regulator's point of view, how do you standardize across all the different digital identity providers?
Well, the question is either how to standardize or how to make them interoperable, and how do you make an identity portable? How do you create an environment where I can use the same identity in different instances, or where I can use multiple identities which I share with some people and not with others? This is a little bit based on the famous Windhover principles, which you're familiar with and which I've been involved with as well 2 or 3 years ago.
So tell me, and where is your thinking on it? How fast is this area developing?
Difficult to say whether it's slower or quicker than expected. I do think that we see a lot of momentum. I do think that the technical capabilities are there, and we will see them developing either in the banking area, as I said before, or in countries with huge populations like India, where people don't have a paper identity, and when they will move from a no identity situation to a digital identity situation immediately where there is a need. In both instances, banking on the one side and people who have no paper identity, there is a need for digital identity, although at different levels, but still it's the same need.
And there's a huge issue with refugees. We've seen obviously the refugees from the Middle East, from Africa coming west. If you look forward to issues like climate change affecting countries like Bangladesh, where we expect the next wave of climate refugees to come, presumably this is only an area that's going to grow. I mean, it's the wrong word to use a market, but there is a market for providing an identity for somebody who has to leave their country quickly.
Well, there's definitely a need to provide identities to these people with all the difficulties that are surrounding these efforts to provide identities to these people, quite frankly, I think that from my perspective, this is not the first area where we're going to develop digital identities, because the basic foundations are missing to set up these digital identities. Whereas when you have people that are living in a certain area who have a community around them, it's much easier to set up a digital identity.
And do you think banking is going to be the area where it happens quickest?
Yeah, banking and the development world as well.
Okay.
Development world as well, yes, absolutely. India, for example, is a good example. Africa, in certain instances. We've seen in Africa people, who have been using mobile phones for like now a decade or more, and these mobile phones were an accelerator for the development, which was unheard of actually before. The classical example of the fisherman who got a mobile phone, etc. I mean, it's well known these days.
Jean-Louis, thank you so much for stopping by my table here at Innovate Finance. And
Thank you.
I'm Edie Lush.